Hello everybody and welcome to the Institute for Government for this third in our series that we're delighted to be hosting in partnership with the Forum at Imperial College London. Welcome to everybody who's made it to the room, well done, and welcome to everybody online. I'm Jill Rutter, I'm a Senior Fellow at the Institute for Government. I'm going to introduce my panel in a second. Just a reminder though, that if you want to pose questions and you're not in the room, then use Slido. If you're in the room, you actually have the option of Slidoing or putting your hand up. Slido is great because I can sort of arbitrate who's asking what. If you see a question that you like, that is a slightly inferior version of the one you're about to ask, do upvote it rather than just replicate, because then we know where the real interest in the room lies. But anyway, so today we're talking about green skills. And apologies for my colleague Emma Norris, who's not with us and had hoped to be chairing this, but the rest of our panel has turned up, so that's extraordinary good news. So I am joined by Sam Alvis. Sam is Head of Economy at Green Alliance, sitting on my far left. Then Ian O'Donnell, Net Zero and Special Projects Lead at the Federation of Small Businesses. Might ask him a bit about those special projects if we don't have enough to talk about green skills, but I think we will. Alyssa Gilbert, Director of Policy and Translation at the Grantham Institute for Climate Change and the Environment. And last but by no means least, our very own Tom Sasse, Associate Director of the Institute for Government and who leads our net zero work here. So what we're going to do is I'm going to pitch off with a few questions to our panel, but get your questions coming in. Tweet along, hashtag IFG Net Zero. We'll be tweeting from our IFG events account if you're not there. So remember to send your questions in and we will talk among ourselves for the first bit, and then we'll try and weave in all the questions that are emerging from the room. This is obviously a very good day to be doing this because the Climate Change Committee has just released their latest progress report, which I think gives the verdict that the government's very good on ambition. In some areas, it's actually got quite credible plans. In other areas, I don't know whether the opposite of quite credible has quite incredible plans or no credible plans, but it's not so complimentary. But really interestingly, they have this concept where they divide the sort of things into what you need to do, some of the policies, and then they have the key enablers, and skills is one of their key enablers. So it's a really important issue to get to grips with. And of course, skills and just labour are incredibly big issues in the economy generally at the moment, even if we're not looking at net zero. So it's a really timely discussion. So let's kick off. Sam, I think Green Alliance did a recent report looking at skills needed to support the net zero transition, and you identified a number of gaps. So what did your research find?
Well, I think a number of gaps is putting it slightly mildly, in that there is a huge gap to get to net zero across the economy, and it sounds like a big problem, but I actually think it's quite a manageable one. Because we need to distinguish between actually places where we're starting to get the right skills, and you're right to raise the CCC, that's broadly where we have the right plans. So if you look at electric vehicles, that seems to be going okay in terms of our skill provision. But if you look at somewhere like home insulation, where the government has no idea how it wants to insulate homes, make them warmer, make them cheaper for your energy bills, we have huge gaps in terms of heat pump installers, maintenance operatives, insulators, and we are currently relying on sole tradespeople rather than a full workforce. And actually that link between plans and skill shortages, as we found almost a perfect correlation between the bigger the emissions gap and emissions reduction required, the bigger the skills shortages, because we need more people to do the work that is going to bring down emissions. But the reason I think that's a manageable problem is actually 80% of the people that are currently in the workforce will still be in the workforce in 2030. It's really a current workforce problem. So that comes down to retraining the current workforce. And for large amounts of people, their work will stay broadly the same. They will adapt to new technologies, new business processes alongside the decarbonisation. It's not going to cause mass unemployment, mass disruption like we saw in the 70s and 80s, for example. So I think what the onus needs to be then on how do we equip people currently in work to learn new things on the job and convince them that security, prosperity for their work comes from moving into greener areas.
So, Ian, so Sam's given this quite sort of rosy picture, maybe a picture of opportunities in the skills area, and all you need is to persuade people to take a bit of time out, retrain, and then there's this huge big horizon of new opportunities that's going to open up for them. So you represent small businesses in the Federation of Small Businesses. You know, is that a realistic vision that small business can do that? I mean, can your members actually get people to take up opportunities now?
I think you alluded to many of the deliverers in some of these spaces are sole traders or very small businesses. And there's two challenges there. One, at the moment, they're strapped. So they're strapped for cash, they're strapped for time. And so taking time out to go and reskill, retrain, involves a cost to your business, even if that training is offered for free. So there's a real challenge around how do you reskill, retrain. It needs to be demand-led. So unless there's a clear demand there, they're just not going to go for it. So unless, as you say, there's sometimes some great ambitions, but unless there's a clear strategy for delivery and how it's actually going to happen, and therefore how they can get commercial advantage by providing into that space, at the moment they're just going to wait and see because they don't have the budget or the time to go and do that reskilling. And in terms of taking people on board to broaden their impact, there's a real problem across the board, not just in green skills, around recruitment, skills. That whole area is a massive challenge for all of our members across the board. So the green skills is just another area where we're saying, great, but we can't get the people. We can't get the skills. We're struggling for money. We're struggling for time.
So if you could get the people, I might come on to Alyssa here. If you get the people, are the sort of training providers, further education and then maybe higher education as well for the sort of top end of the skills training, are they actually providing the right courses, the right training? So if people have the time and the money and the inclination, can they go and find what they need?
Well, we still need more of it. We definitely don't have enough at the moment. So what is positive is that the higher education sector, so I work at a university, are working closely with the further education sector and understand that there needs to be really close linkages there and a sort of a kind of sharing of responsibility. You do this is your kind of natural audience, this is our kind of natural audience. So that's good. But there absolutely needs to be more provision. I think the tricky bit coming from the higher education side is the higher education sector is really used to serving people at a certain stage in their life for a certain period of time, and then that's it. So there's a steady flourishing of new master's programs, and they're extremely successful. So we have a climate change management and finance master's course at Imperial, and it's now the master's program in our business school that has the best employability credentials.
And so who goes to that, and what jobs do they end up doing?
So that's an interesting example. That kind of thing is people going to professional services. Those people go into the finance sector, but they go into the finance sector with the kind of skills they might have got from business school, plus an understanding of the science of climate change, plus some other analytical tools. So they go in with some traditional skills plus. So this is one of the things about green skills is that what we hope is that people will have some green or climate skills they can apply whatever their job is. And some of those are technical, like I just kind of said, understanding the climate science and understanding how to use that in financial sector analytics. Some of it is another type of skill set, which universities and perhaps other education institutions aren't so used to providing, which is different ways of thinking. So actually you need to be quite flexible in your mindset and adaptable and willing to pick up new technology and giving people those soft skills is important. And then at a place like Imperial, where we teach a lot of people technical skills, these are really important, but we also need to teach people a bit about social science. How do people make their decisions? And going on to the kind of boiler installer example, if you've got, you're refitting your home heating, and you might be tempted because you've heard something about low carbon heating, but you're a bit nervous. Who will you trust? You'll trust the installer who's coming, and you'll say to them, well, what do you think? Have you done this before? And they'll think, well, I don't know how to do this. But if they do know how to do it, they might say, oh, I've only really done it once. You know, stick with what you know. And that relationship, training people to think in different ways and be willing to understand the scale of the risk of doing something different is also something we need to build into our education system.
And I think there's a key differentiation there that you've alluded to between there's two sets of skills we talk about. There's the skills that are needed in business to allow them to change and transition to a carbon zero economy. And there's also the hard skills and the technical skills to do the delivery of what's needed to make that happen. So we need the people who can do carbon accounting and all that goes with that, but we also need the people who can put the solar panels on the roofs, who can put the air pump systems in, et cetera, And one of the challenges is the more consultancy skills, very well catered for by FEHE, but those other skills, those are people who've already got level 3 qualifications, and our current system is very good at saying, if you want to go up to level 4, but actually what we're saying is we want another level 3 in a different area, and often the support and the methodologies around that don't exist. We're needing transition of skills rather than upskilling.
So I'm quite interested, Tom, I will let you in a second, but you're like the home team, so. But I'm just quite interested. I mean, we did see quite a big transition around solar panels, which nobody presumably had installed solar panels before the year 2000, and then we suddenly had a massive incentive and we got a lot of solar panel installation. So actually, how did we fill the gap on, or is it very easy? It's just like, basically roof tile, solar panel, same thing. I mean, how actually did that happen? Because did government have a big programme to do it, or?
Well, there was a demand created by government, by incentives, and there is a whole other discussion in and of itself around longevity of incentives. So you created demand, therefore business will respond to demand. We're a demand-led economy on the whole. So there was a demand there, so therefore business went, there's an opportunity space, we'll reskill into that space because there was money to be made out of it. Most of the skills, as we've mentioned, are transitionary. So it's not there's a whole new skill set, it's just taking a set of skills and repurposing them. However, in terms of overall numbers, that wasn't that big in terms of the overall challenge of climate change. And if we want to make the level of change that is needed to achieve the ambition of the government, we're going to need more people, not just reskilling of some people. We're also going to need more people in some areas, and that's one of the big challenges.
And to reskill someone, who's a gas fitter to install a heat pump, are we talking a week? Are we talking a month? Are we talking a year? Are we talking 3 years? How long does it take to take a gas fitter and make them
good question? I mean,
to fill a heat pump?
It depends partly on their level of experience and how, you mentioned about creative thinking. Some people are very good at reskilling and adapting, others people less so. I'm alluding more to here, I think most of that can be a relatively speedy process. The question is actually we probably need double the number of people as we've currently got in gas installers. Where are they coming from? What industries are losing people and don't have demand anymore? How do we transition them into a completely new? That's going to be a longer process.
It also comes down to how you think you want to install a heat pump. So you could go with the heat and building strategy, which is the Octopus business model of saying we're going to do every heat pump exactly the same in every house, in which case it's not a long training programme because you're doing the same thing over and over again. If you're looking for more bespoke, harder to fit houses, local tradespeople, then the training programme to understand how you adapt this to many different forms of housing is a lot more in depth.
I think that's a really good point, because often the skills question is almost downstream of some of the policy and delivery choices, in a sense, because if the government doesn't know how it's going to do something, whether that's homes or indeed how much of a particular industry like battery manufacturing we're going to domesticate, how can it know how many people we need to train in those areas? So it's quite difficult for the businesses to try and judge this until we have a clearer sense of some of those policy gaps that the CCC was talking about.
So that's what I was actually going to ask you, Tom, is, the government did have its Green Jobs Task Force, which reported, I think, last year. Do you get a sense that the government has grasped the scale of this and actually their role, in a sense, of clarifying a bit of the demand side, if we then talk about, the supply side? Yeah,
it's interesting. I think it has acknowledged the scale of the Green Jobs Challenge, and when you see sort of ministers, and in particular the Prime Minister, talking about this, one of their favourite things to say about net zero is green jobs, that's what they like to talk about. But I don't, and they did set up the Green Jobs Task Force, but I don't think they've yet well, they haven't yet published a Green Jobs Action Plan, which I think, as the CCC rightly says, is the big thing that's missing. So we've got this report from the task force, which is a kind of interesting bit of background type thinking. It sort of sets out some of the kind of considerations in this area. It's not a programme of action. And then you sort of think the really big missed opportunity actually was in the Levelling Up white paper, which really didn't touch on net zero much at all. That was the government's real plan for economic transformation. It had a lot in there on skills, didn't have a lot in there on green skills. So I think what you probably need to see in that sort of Green Skills Action Plan, which the CCC calls for, definitely is a bigger sort of funding and policy offer on skills, like Alyssa says. And I think you can look at the sort of range of things the government has come forward with, apprenticeship levy, lifetime skills offer and things like that. But actually some of those are quite narrow and not sort of available to a really wide range of people. And I think you'd also need to start thinking about targeting more specifically at some of the areas we're talking about, like home retrofit and things like that. I think a second thing is around data. Actually, in that action plan, you'd want a really clear view of the quantity and type of skills you're going to need across the country. And I don't think at the moment the government quite has that. And then a third thing and final thing, I think, is just this kind of coordination and a cross-government issue. Because I think at the moment what we're seeing is individual sectoral plans come out with a kind of small section on the skills requirement and dependency for that particular sector or that particular area. What we haven't got is a kind of cross-government view of skills, green skills across the economy, and what you'd need to sort of make that work in a joined-up way.
Some questions coming in now. Thanks very much, everybody, for your question. Remember to upvote. Remember to moderate as well, moderator. A quick question to Alyssa, just from Mike, who's given his name, so I'm definitely going to ask his question. Would it help if any of this was actually in A-level syllabuses? I mean, do you think that teaching net zero at A-level, we've always had long discussions about teaching climate change as part of geography and stuff like that. Would it help if people were socialised into some of these things? He suggested on it, so we need people knowing how to install solar PV. Not sure my A-level has taught me how to install anything. But anyway, that was clearly a wrong selection.
I mean, yes, the answer is yes. I think we need everybody to come out of school understanding this challenge to some degree. It doesn't need to be a huge level in depth challenge, but it just needs to be lodged there somewhere in their head, and equally at universities. So you can go through a university degree, almost all university degrees, and never think about this issue, or indeed a small number of other perhaps globally important challenge issues. And if you had that as a kind of core set, then you could apply whatever it is you're going to do, whether you're going to be a scientist, or you're going to be an engineer, or you're going to be someone in finance, or someone in politics and government who mostly don't have science or engineering degrees, then you would have that bit of basis that you would come back to. And although, I mean, we talk about the challenge around skills, and I'm a broad optimist about this too, I think we'll be able to navigate this. What is good is that the attitudes, we don't have to worry about attitudes. So in terms of people coming out, what we want them to come out of their secondary school education with is a bit of more knowledge about the issue. But we don't need to change their hearts, though the hearts and attitudes of those people will already lead them to think, how can I do something with my job about this? And if it's handed to them or it's easy for them to grasp, those people will do it. In a way, I think it's the reskilling that's the people who are already working, who are short of time that you mentioned.
Okay, let's come on to reskilling. If we're going to fill the reskilling gap, I'm going to come back to the questions in a second. If we want to fill the reskilling gap, let's go to Sam, and then I'm going to try Ian, whether it's realistic. What would you want? If the government's serious about reskilling and says, okay, we've got a decade to reskill the labour force to be ready to do mass installation of this, manage this EV, manage a world in which increasing numbers of cars are EVs, so you'll have to fix them rather than fixed ICEs and stuff like that. Actually, what does the government need to put in place for a reskilling strategy? Is clarity about what's needed enough, and then the market will follow, like it did with solar? Or does the government need to intervene?
I think there's two additional things, and starting off with what Tom said is the right idea. So we need to have this picture of what government thinks are skills, and where it's a strategic national priority to boost skills in that area. That informs education institutions, it informs businesses to say, we'll put on an extra course because we see this is going to be quite good for us. But the two things government needs to do initially, and on top of that, is one, it needs to lower the cost of training. both for individuals and for businesses. At the moment, investing in physical capital, you can get 130% tax relief from the Treasury through the super deduction, which is lovely, but nothing for investment.
It does expire next year.
It does expire next year, but what we should be doing is looking at how can we make it cheaper for businesses to invest in their staff and the soft skills that we need to take the economy forward. And then on the flip side of that, we did 10 focus groups last year with people who would need reskilling in the net zero economy. And their number one concern was personal security, financial, economic, can they still provide for their households? And that needs two things. One, it needs government to convince them this isn't a political gimmick. Green jobs is not just a slogan, there's content behind it. And then against your green jobs action plan, whatever you want to call it, where you think it's really important and we've got a big gap, pay the costs of that training. And not just the cost of that training, you need to give people maintenance loans so they can just take the decision and it's not going to hurt them at the bottom line.
Ian.
Yeah, so one of our proposals has been around Help to Green. So we've had the Help to Grow initiative. How do we help small micro businesses get going with this? A straightforward, accessible, because some of the longer term tax incentive type ones don't necessarily work for a micro or small business, but a straightforward system like Help to Grow, implemented as Help to Green, would be great.
And so what's that, just grants?
So providing a grant to get that training, and crucially for the business. So Help to Grow is primarily owned by business owners. And if we want to get businesses going for this, we've first of all got to get the business owners on board with it. So we need to make it possible for them to access this in a way that's affordable for them, bearing in mind all the other stuff that a micro business, the business owner is responsible for everything. They don't have HR directors or anything. So how do we enable that? So I think that's one area. So there's that helping businesses to adapt and change. When it comes to the wider skill piece about actually doing some of the stuff, we need to, as you mentioned, it's not just about the cost of the training, it's about the cost of the time for that. So how do we look at that for a micro business? But also there's a big challenge here. If we take electric cars, EVs, I'm in the West Midlands. We were given the information by White Manufacturing Group that there's about 50% increase required in electrical engineers and developers to deliver the change to EVs. Well, also in the West Midlands is Silicon Valley area. A lot of the gaming industry is based in the West Midlands. If all of those people go to EVs, our gaming industry dies. So how do we not ensure that we don't just lose people to the green skills and actually other areas of business are decimated as a result? Because the reality at the moment, we're at almost 100% employment. And so if you take skills from one area and move them to another area, you're leaving a gap somewhere else. So there's a wider piece here about just overall access to resource.
I think that's can I just come in? Just in terms of framing this green skills challenge within the wider labour market challenge that we have in the economy at the moment, because I think we've got a few things where, we've got, we're at full employment, we haven't got very many sort of vacancies left at the moment, but also with Brexit, you've got real challenges in sectors like construction. So before the pandemic, the construction sector was already saying around net zero that they had a sort of acute and persistent skills gap, and that's becoming much worse actually as a result of not being able to bring people here as easily as we were able to before. So I think there's a real challenge, and I think the other big one is sort of digitalisation. Automation as well is going to have big changes coming down. And post-COVID, we've seen a number of people leave the workforce seemingly permanently at the sort of older end of the workforce. So I think what you'd hope to see in that sort of government green skills action plan is a really coherent view of how this transition fits in around all the other headwinds that the UK economy is facing, and sort of what are the measures and what are the trade-offs that are happening at different areas.
I mean, the slight worry is this begins to sound like sort of national plan for the labour force, which, I think it's quite interesting sort of balance. I mean, how big a role does government have in sort of doing things? And and how, it sounds a bit like directed labour, that this is where we want people and things like that. Does that work?
I go back to the point that you made earlier, which I really agree with. These things are demand-led. So I think government's role is to kind of set out a clear, coherent and consistent path. I mean, that's maybe too many things to ask for, but I mean, a path maybe that they're committed to that will set in train the demand aspect. And then there's all kinds of different ways that I think we'll see the skills provision development flourish, and we'll see some of the people who can provide these services start to realize there's demand and start to seek the training. So the higher education sector, the further education sector are already innovating around what to provide in this space together, and providing sort of later on how can we access skilling up, reskilling people later on, particularly with a place-based focus. So you mentioned leveling up. Universities who are in places where there's lots of offshore wind development are thinking about skills in those areas and reskilling people from other offshore activities. So those things will flourish. So in a sort of more hands-off way, I think the key role for government is clear signals that set and train the demand for these kind of
jobs.
jobs.
And should the government take into account potential labour blockages when it does its pathways and timelines? Does it sort of need to think, well, actually, we are in a labour-constrained economy, at least for the time being, and therefore we need to take into account that? Or do we just say, well, actually, this is what we need for net zero, this is as fast as we can go, technologically constrained, and the labour thing will sort itself out, and we want to be a high-wage economy? And
you have an informed opinion, I have an opinion.
Well, I was just going to comment about one of our challenges. We have an increasingly ageing workforce. If you look at also the demographic, which is perhaps less convinced sometimes about climate change, that tends to also be towards the older end of the workforce. If we want to win hearts and minds and perhaps encourage them to stay longer in work and to look at reskilling, we need to win their hearts and minds, and perhaps that would be more pragmatic hearts and minds, which goes back to your comment about creating demand, whereby, you're going to get a good job into your 60s because actually this is a consistent path forward, rather than at the moment. Some of those people have been badly burned because maybe they were involved in the solar thing and then 2 years later it disappeared and their job disappeared again. So we need that consistency, and we need to win some of those people back to say, don't exit the labour market just yet, because we need you to deliver.
I think you might be a few months too late, actually, as far as we can see from what's going on in the labour market. So, Deborah, a slightly technical question here from things, and if anyone wants to ask a question in the audience, then put your mitt up. Anonymous, thanks Anonymous, is saying it's tricky for awarding organisations to develop lower level qualifications given the current review and moratorium. I don't know whether that's an issue. Ian, is that a big issue? It says government needs to give greater freedom to develop in this space. Is the government getting in the way?
Yes.
So what does the government need to, so first thing in government is always to get out of the way where you're making things worse. What does the government
One of the
do?
big things we've heard a lot from members, particularly in this space, is about we know what's needed, we know what reskilling is needed, but at the moment, looking at apprenticeships, looking at things like that, we're having to force fit rather than find one that's actually appropriate, that matches our need. And one of the demands is actually just let us get on with creating the right type of training with an outcome qualification, but we shape that far more than a prescriptive qualification, because the nature of this area of the economy, it's rapidly changing. And the problem with traditional skills accreditation creation is it's quite a long process. And by the time that process is finished, the demand has changed. And so business just said, just get out of our way, let us create and adapt things that meet the need that we need to allow people who rightly want qualifications, but also just need to be able to deliver the skills that are needed for that business to get on with doing what they need to do.
But as Alyssa was saying, one of the sort of things I want is an assurance that, Ian coming to fit my heat pump knows what Ian is doing. So are we clear that we actually have good enough accreditation that people are competent with some of these sort of new technologies that give me the assurance as a slightly nervy, unconvinced consumer that I trust you to fit quite an expensive piece of kit when I've read, Daily Mail telling me it's all a nightmare and a bunch of cowboys are about to come into my house? Do we need to do more on that?
I think there's a difference, isn't there, between having the skills and the knowledge of how to fit something, and also the processes and assurances to make sure that what I do is good.
Yeah.
And actually, they're two slightly different things. And it's good for businesses to make sure, we've got things like ISO 9001, etc., which help a business make sure they've got good processes in place, follow good practice. What we can't do is be too prescriptive about, you must have this skill. because actually that skill is now changed. It's this skill that's needed. And so all I've got is a qualification that's taught me the wrong skill for what I'm now having to do. So we need to have, as you said, about flexibility and in imagination and innovation in terms of how I'm approaching problems for businesses.
So, Alyssa, do you see a proliferation of sort of, people adding green to the title of their courses and the way in which government used to add that to everything? When I was making sustainability, just as market it, and you say, well, that's pretty low grade. I mean,
yes, but students are very discerning. I mean, the courses that we offer aren't free.
Someone's asked, can you do something about the cost of your courses?
So I can't. Definitely beyond my pay grade. But people are quite specific. They look actually quite closely into the content of the course. So just a name on top of it won't achieve.
So you think sort of cream is rising and the
I think people are.
So we don't need to worry about that.
But actually, what we again, to go back to the focus groups around younger people who knew what they wanted to do in their careers, particularly we saw some dentists and nurses, and they were like, we know this is a really important thing for us to have on our CV. Like, I really want some green skills because it's going to put me at the top of the pack. But they can't find a course that has how to reduce waste on your hospital ward. It's those additional things alongside your standard course, rather than just slapping green, that's like a bit of a USP for your university or further education organisation. I think it's really
That's a really interesting point. So me and some of my colleagues, we deliver occasional courses in the medical school at Imperial to people on environmental stuff. And we're getting more and more demand for these little pockets of teaching people who they're on a completely vocational path, right? And there's more and more demand for people in those kind of sectors.
And does Imperial treat that as an option, or is that part of the core training?
That at the moment is part of an option, but if the demand, it's again like there's more demand for it.
That's really interesting. Someone here has asked whether we should give people incentives to do green courses. That's partly based on costing $31,800 to do it, so people can't do it. Let's go to the audience. So Penny is wandering with a mic. Let's start here and then we'll come down here. Yeah.
Thank you, Jill. Hugh Lloyd. A couple of observations and one sort of test question, you might say. So the first observation, it feels like anybody over 40 should get some systems thinking experience or qualification. Because if you don't understand systems in the broad sense and in the particular sense, you will always be focused on solution X or Y or Z. That leads me into, the future of your building and your home will not be a heat pump. It will be an energy system. And the heat pump might be a part of it, but it might not. Don't focus on the bit of kit. Focus on the functional thing. So some systems practice. But Jill, you were touching on, you almost got to national service, I think. So people have been talking about demand-led. Yet net zero and climate change are not demand-led. They are physical processes that will destroy the planet. If we wait for demand to materialise and give us the courses that we think we need or that we will need, that might take too long. So you're, in a sense, wall footing for climate change might actually require a national green skills service where, my dad did his national service and he learned skills about electrical engineering, as it happens. So where would we panellists put ourselves on that? How much of this does need to be pushed? Because it's a mandated government action. It's against a physical process that's affecting the world, which won't go away just because we don't respond to it. How far down the road to national service, which would then pay for your training time as well as your training? Thank you. Okay, well, let's have a very quick round of answers on how sort of aspiration to... it's a test question as well. So do we need a sort of national... I mean, I know that various times we've tried to do these, like the Australian Energy Efficiency Scheme, which is part of their GFC response, was deemed to be quite a big setback for cause of energy efficiency. Sam?
Yeah, so I think you talk about the urgency that we need to do this stuff, and I think getting a government to make people, this government to make people do work is probably waiting too long to get the people into the work. We tried a couple of times in the sort of green recovery. There was a lot of talk about an environmental service and giving young people experience in tackling sort of the biodiversity crisis, and it just didn't really take off. But I do think if government says we have a massive strategic need in this area and we will cover all the costs of training and getting you into it, and look at this lovely, fantastic, long-term, secure, good conditions job you have at the end, potentially unionised, that is enough of a pull to get people in.
Ian?
I would say that the demand, because people perhaps believe it the right thing to do, may not be there. The demand from a perspective as a business owner, if you don't do this, there's fines, or you won't be able to apply for procurement opportunities, all of those sort of things generate significant demand. And if you look at the house building, etc., then again, how are we going to be penalised? And right now, there's a demand being created by the fact my energy bill is rising, and so I'm looking at ways to reduce my energy bill. So I think the demand is there. We just need to get out of the way of it and make sure it's consistent demand.
Yeah, I mean, just to kind of make sure I express what I said about demand appropriately, I mean that the government should make ambitious demands that are in line with net zero. They should be saying that we're going to retrofit every single house in the UK in the next 10 years. That is a clear demand signal that will lead to serious upskilling and training if it's certain that that's going to happen. That's what we need to do because the issue demands it. And that will lay in process those other things.
Tom?
So I think what we're seeing at the moment in some ways is the sort of limitations. So I think you can do net zero in either way, right? You can do it in a very market-based direction or you can do it in a more kind of state-led sort of state investment, public investment direction. I think at the moment what we're seeing is the limitations of a kind of very market-based approach this government has set out, but without sufficiently clear market incentives and market signals. We've seen those market signals in some areas and at a very high level, the sort of 35 target for different things. We've not seen it in key areas like housing, So that makes it really difficult to work backwards through what the skills you need and what the businesses and what the training providers are going to do and things like that. I wouldn't perhaps go as far as the sort of national service route. I don't want to sort of make up an IFG position on the spot on that. But I would say that I think, in somewhere like home retrofit and home heating, we probably are going to need to see a much more interventionist approach from the government to actually get it moving at the speed that we need.
I mean, should the government be setting out sort of there's sort of a question here about whether the government should be setting out sort of priorities, that this is where we're looking for first. This is maybe where we'll go at slightly slower time. So at least sort of FE providers, for example, who are looking to sort of change their training, sort of know, well, actually, I should be focusing first on trying to give this training. I don't know. I mean, I think the tricky thing about this issue, as you raised, is that it's urgent. We need to do it all now. So it's hard to say this is more important now than another thing. I think, but what I do think that this issue about place is really important. So it could be possible to say, in this bit of the country, this bit of the UK, we actually really need land management skills because with certain land management skills, we'll be able to do more sustainable agriculture that's more adaptive and more mitigation. And actually, in this part, we need the kind of skills that we need for offshore wind. And here we need EV skills. You mentioned kind of the Midlands. That could be really helpful because what you do see also, it's quite common for HE and FE organizations to work very closely with employers and with local government in areas. So they create this community, and together that combination with a strong local skills signal can help.
Can I just add, Jill? So I think just on that, I think if you think about where the UK economy is traditionally quite strong, we've got a very strong academic university sector. We've had this whole move from manufacturing into services. We've got a strong financial sector. We've got a very strong city still. So you can look at those areas and you can think, actually, we're probably going to do quite well in terms of, some of those softer skills we've talked about, making sure people have green accounting skills, making all of that stuff. I think where the government should probably focus its efforts is where we've traditionally been weaker, which is on things like technical education, and on thinking about some of the kind of, skills needed for some of these really big physical transitions that we're going to need to see this decade. Because that's where actually, at the moment, leaving it to the market with a slightly muddy set of incentives isn't really working.
Just on also in terms of who do you get to do what first, one of the issues we're spotting is that there's a tendency sometimes for government to go for the big wins, which means big business. If a big company makes a change, it can have a bigger impact. But 97% of businesses in the UK are SMEs. And so if we want to make an overall big impact, we need to bring all of them on board. And that means they need to be dealt with and looked after in a different way and supported and incentivised to do so. And at the moment, there's a tendency, we'll get a big win over here, which will make nice sounding soundbite. But actually, if we want the overall big impact that we need to bring everybody on board on this journey.
But is that government's task? Because your big company, by and large, has a long supply chain. We're all into supply chain. It's the year of the supply chain. Understanding that, actually, Brexit helped with that as well. But But, you know, will smaller companies get assistance from companies they supply to in meeting standards? Because companies need to give assurance that, you know...
It's one of the things that we're sort of saying actually, you know, needs to be a part of the solution, which is if you're a bigger company, you've got a supply chain, you might have the skills, you're employing the people, you're employing the carbon calculators, etc. people, rather than sort of just beating your supply chain with a stick. How about helping them on the journey? But I do think government needs to be a part of that solution as well.
Okay.
There's been some good examples actually in the past with the supermarket retail sector and them looking at their supply chain and then engaging with the people who are their growers on things like sustainability to enable them to, rather than saying, here are our standards as a retailer, oh, I'm sorry, you can't supply us anymore. They engaged in a way that could enable them to remain a supplier.
Okay, we've got another question here in the audience. Yes.
Hi, Emma Wilcox from Society for the Environment. We've talked a lot about the volume of provision that's required and the volume of skills training, but not talked about quality. And a lot of companies, particularly small businesses who are reskilling, they wouldn't go to the HE or FE sector, they'd go to the private sector for training. So just interested in the panel's view on how we can protect small businesses from working with training providers to make sure we've got good quality, particularly when we know we need to upskill a lot of trainers who also don't exist at the moment.
Okay, who'd like to pitch in at that first? Alyssa?
I don't know. I don't have an expert answer on that, but I think one of the things that came up before, which I think could really help, is collaboration with business. So looking for good accreditation where you can, if not going to HE and FE, because it is a really high risk. You don't want people to waste that precious time and money on a course that's no good. But I think working with businesses so that they also kind of accredit a business. So, for example, if you want to install, I shouldn't probably name a brand, but let's say a Hitachi heat pump, right? It's in their interest that the people who are installing give people confidence in their product and install it correctly. And if you could go to a course where you had the stamp of approval of a provider, I think that's a nice way to work in concert and provide quality.
Yeah, I think one of the areas that I think actually when he talks about product type intervention, then actually that absolutely can work and does work. Where I think there's going to be a bigger challenge is around the whole, you know, for businesses looking to adapt and change and needing the consultant and the training to allow them to do so. There's a big opportunity for blue plating here. Oh, you need to do all of this as well. Yeah. No, you don't. But in order for me to charge the big consultancy fee that I want to charge, I'm going to say you need to do all of this as well. So I think we need to make sure that this space, being an emergent space, doesn't end up with the inevitable problems in emergent spaces where people are a bit unsure that they go to the consultant who blue plates the issue and you end up with doing far more than you actually need to do.
I mean, we have a sort of plea from the heart here from Sarah Coffey, who's saying, how will it be regulated? I'm currently staring at a hole in my ceiling from a cowboy plumber. How do we keep the green incentives regulated? Lots of us can relate to that as a problem in getting sort of people in. So
I mean, we have to remember this. We're not creating brand new sectors, right?
Yeah.
We're greening existing sectors. So where there are sectors and there are already cowboys and bad training organizations, they're going to, and we need to do something about that. That's a kind of separate issue.
Maybe we can solve two problems at once. Yes, we've got another question back there.
Thanks very much. Alex Luke from Onward here. I wanted to ask the panel about what we've seen in energy efficiency policy recently, where with the Green Deal and the Green Homes Grant, there were many cases of installers and suppliers retraining after the policies were announced, who then had sort of the rug pulled under them a bit when those schemes were scrapped. And what's the risk that those past policy failures could undermine the transition and the skills transition in energy efficiency policy? Yeah. And I guess there's also a sort of chicken and egg question with energy efficiency specifically, in that we clearly need something to incentivise demand. But then we need the installers and providers in sufficient numbers to then meet that demand when it happens. So what needs to happen first? Yeah,
I'm going to link that to a question that I got online from Claire, who's asking, do you expect the Exchequer to come up with a fully fledged plan on green skills qualifications in the autumn budget? I'm not going to ask you to predict that, but I'm going to ask you, if you were going to do that, you know, the government has now finally sort of woken up to the fact that energy efficiency might help with people's very high bills. Yeah. So actually, if you were focusing between the next mini budget, which would probably be, you know, not too far off or whatever, or the autumn budget, what would you want the government to be saying to actually build a decent energy efficiency sector? And what lessons should it take from Green Deal, Green Homes Grant? Sam?
So I think there's two answers to this. And Treasury are basically looking at the moment is like, how many policy levers can we pull to deliver energy efficiency? And one is that you need to complete the entire able to pay market, right? Like you have to have some sort of incentive for people to do that. But I think you're right in that the sector and individuals are badly scarred by two massive policy failures, not to say that the Treasury are also massively scarred and really wary of getting their fingers burnt for a third time. So the way I would look at it is, how do we build those supply chains up now quickly so that they are credible and ready to be deployed to the able to pay sector? Just complete social housing. Like the local authority delivery scheme and the social housing decarbonisation fund is working, and it's working very well, and the government are rightly proud of it. Get it done. Just finish every single one. And although those homes are not quite as needy as some as like the private rented sector, if you finish it, you have this massive everywhere based supply chain that you can then go, okay, we've got some slightly harder, we've got individuals, we've brought the cost down, hopefully, and use it then.
Anything to add? What do you want the Chancellor to say?
The key thing is around longevity of plans. So, we don't want the 1 year, 2 year scheme. We want, this is a 10-year scheme. If you've got that surety of scheme, then, as we've already mentioned, businesses will adapt and change and provide service into that. Also, one of the things I think we need to, just on the rented accommodation, this includes offices, there is actually a challenge sometimes around the business or whatever that's in an office not actually being the ones who have the control. So they desperately want to lower their energy bill, but actually they don't own the building, and sometimes even finding out who does own the building can be quite challenging.
We're not even allowed to turn our own heating off. So,
and then on top of that, we have a rate system whereby you are disincentivised in some cases. They have created some exclusions. They've made some changes, so heat pumps specifically are being excluded from this. But as somebody was mentioned from the audience, it's looking at overall changes to your building, and we need to make sure that the rate system doesn't disincentivise. So I know we've slightly off the topic of skills here, but it is that if we're going to generate demand, we need to make sure we remove all the barriers to demand as well. And those are just some examples of barriers to demand.
Alyssa, we've got a really interesting question here from Anonymous, which I always assume is just a whole bunch of people in the business department putting in their sort of questions they're trying to answer today. So you could help Anonymous with this one. We talk a lot about reskilling the sort of labour force, but do we actually have this untapped bunch of people who can teach these skills, or is that a big constraint that we need to be dealing with first?
So it's a big question. Yes, we not everybody knows what they need to know. I think someone did an analysis, like 75% of secondary school teachers, or I think maybe primary and secondary school teachers who would like to teach this don't feel like they know.
And what about trainers in FE colleges?
Right, exactly. So we need to kind of mobilise some way to support those people with some kind of continuous professional development. I mean, I think there are ways. We've developed some online courses, and there are sort of ways that you can take the knowledge of a few people and share it in a way that can start to become helpful to those people.
And is that actually what we should be starting now, to sort of make sure we have that sort of skilled up training workforce before we even get into?
Yeah, we should. I mean, one of my colleagues has been invited into an inset day in a secondary school next term, which is a nice way to do it. So taking a bit of people's time to start building that.
Put those 12-year-olds to work in. No, that's a bit 19th century.
I think it sort of comes back to a much longer term failure on sort of adult training and skills policy in the UK over decades, really, because you can't, as Boris Johnson, you can't just sort of sit there and announce a lifetime skills guarantee and then just expect this sort of sector to sprout up and to have well-paid people willing to train all these adults sort of already there. So I think that the fact that it is a pretty poorly paid, quite insecure, sort of little bits of funding becoming available type of sector does create a real problem.
So, Tom, I want to come back to Hal's point a bit about the people who need to understand the system. In my house, I don't actually get to choose the energy system which I'm going to be part of, though maybe I do in Hal's world, but I don't think I do, and actually I don't particularly want to. I just want to know what my options are and which one I should take. But if we look at the people who are making the decisions, so people in government, ministers and civil servants, Alyssa's already alluded to perhaps their lack of attendance at Imperial College and the fact they all went to Oxford and did PPE or history or classics or something like that. All very good degrees in their own way. Do we actually have the right structures and capabilities to make decisions about these sorts of decisions in government to understand these things, do you think? Do they understand systems enough? Do they understand engineering capabilities?
No, I don't think
whatever?
we do. I mean, you and I have written a report which pointed out. I think there is a real paucity of engineering skills in government. Was one of the things we identified, and actually, we have seen both ministers and officials this kind of dominance of kind of arts, humanities. You get some economics in there. But actually, these people who can think about systems in this way are really lacking. I think that's important both for the sort of coordination point, so you can look at the Council of Science and Technology and the way they've called for a sort of systems approach to net zero, understanding that actually all these different sectors are interacting with one another and needing a view. But also, like you're saying, for understanding how to make policy on something quite complex like how to have a low-carbon home and what sort of policy incentives are needed to support people. When you look at it from the consumer end, I think, personally, I think you're right. I don't think most consumers need to be worrying about exactly what, rates of performance for this type of low-carbon heating product versus that low-carbon heating product. What they want is really good advice about how to have their home as warm as they want it for an affordable price and not to have too disruptive a process to get there. And I think that's where it comes back to some of the other things we've been talking about, like sort of really solid energy advice and consumer advice and consumer protection.
And Alyssa, if you're looking at government, I mean, we're not going to change out the entire cadre. I mean, we might cut 91,000 civil service jobs, as Jacob Rees-Mogg wants. Like you stymie the entry of new skills rather than encourage it, but in the short run. But actually, how does government position itself to make some of what Boris Johnson might call these big calls on net zero in the next couple of years? Right, what sort of advice, external thinking do they need to be tapping into?
Well, as you said, coincidentally today the Committee on Climate Change published its progress report. The Committee on Climate Change is just such an excellent organisation. And they are set up as the independent government advisor. They are analytically hugely strong. They are very impressive. They have done, they've provided thousands of pages of really good analysis. So I think read it and then do it, I would say.
Okay.
But I think also some of these things about asking that the people who are making decisions understand systems and all of that. Not everybody needs to have a kind of a very high level degree in each of these topics. What they do need to do is understand what they don't know and occasionally get quite an inspiring talk by somebody who knows it. Because I think most of the people who work in the civil service that I've come into contact with are highly, highly intelligent, critically analytical people. And so exposing them to an understanding, here's what the system looks like, and here are the people who know, who can help with that. I think that's the kind of thing that needs to happen.
Ian, do you think they understand business need? We're talking about both politicians and civil service.
I think there's often, I would say they understand big business better. Small business they often really struggle with. Basic things like language. We have a different vocabulary, and that often shows timescales. We have different timescales. Financial investment, we think about things slightly differently. So, for example, a micro business can't afford a 10-year payoff. It just can't afford it, whereas a big business can. And government tends to think in terms of those longer-term payoffs. Micro and small businesses can't. So I think that's an example where if we're going to get this right, we need that. Just as an aside, and this is very much a personal view rather than an FSB view, but also I think we've got to be very careful when looking at all of this, that we don't just go for replacement solutions. We talk about system, we need to look at sometimes overall systems in order to deliver climate change. So it's not just a case of let's switch all our cars from ICE to EVs, but actually how do we change the way we move in this country? And I think that's a harder challenge and really requires people to have that opportunity to big picture think.
Sam, any big gaps you see in the decision-making capabilities in government for...
Well, what's really interesting, so we talked a bit about the Green Jobs Task Force earlier, and there's a new Green Jobs Delivery Group, which is going to take some forward and make it happen. And what I've been a bit worried about is they've gone, oh crap, we need loads of STEM people, we need engineers, we need scientists. And actually what this takes is like some creative people to work out how to join up the dots. So a very practical example is the people in DFE delivering local skills integration plans and the Post-16 Education Act didn't mention net zero once. And it just takes a walk across Victoria Street, go and have a chat with people in bays and think about how these things can work together. It's just having it in civil servants' minds all the time about we have this major national priority, how do I integrate it into all the things I'm doing, not just assume it's another part of government's job.
Okay, we're coming towards the end now. I'm going to merge a couple of questions that I've got. One is it helpful at all to think in terms of green jobs, or is it just too blanket and sort of fluffy and meaningless and stuff like that? The converse one, and you can say where you are on the spectrum, I'm borrowing from Howell's systems thinking here. Aren't all jobs in the future really green jobs? And shouldn't we be thinking like that? So, is it helpful to think about, someone said, we talk about green jobs and just allied to climate change, but what about biodiversity, net gain, all these other things we need? Alyssa mentioned sustainable land management. So everything green, or green is just like sort of vacuous nothing and so it's not helpful?
Green as the jobs that we need to get us to net zero is different to the jobs that you have existing in a net zero world. And that's where we need government to be a bit focused on. We need these people to employ them to do the process of decarbonisation. And then when everything's decarbonised, that's your base level and people are just doing their job as they go about it.
Okay, so change whatever. Tom?
I think that's a really useful distinction to draw out, actually. And I think it's definitely useful to have the definitional challenge, because there is quite a lot of wish-washy talk about green jobs as just a sort of fantastic thing. I think the pitch that it should be a broad definition is the right one. So we shouldn't get trapped in thinking this is just wind farm engineers and heat pump installers and that kind of narrow band. We should think of the transitional green jobs that we need across the economy much more broadly than that, as, what are the skills in the NHS, all of the types of things we've been talking about so far today. So I think you need that wide definition. I think it then helps. So, the government's got some targets around this. So they're sort of talking about around 500,000 green jobs created by the end of the decade.
And what do they mean? Do they mean in the specific, are they the transition
They
jobs?
haven't said particularly clearly yet. So in Net Zero Strategy, you had a bit of language in there. It's one of the things we might hope is going to be in this Green Skills Action Plan that the group that Sam mentioned is meant to be writing. So I think if you have that wide definition, you can sort of be clear about what you're talking about and then start to measure it. I think it can be a reasonably useful concept, but I think it is worth keeping in mind that it's a broad category.
Ian, does any of this speak to any of your members at all?
Yeah, I would say there is a danger that we call jobs green, but actually what we're talking about, as has been alluded to several times, we're talking about skills plus. We're talking about, these are skills, a lot of them are skills that people have already got. We just need to add some knowledge and perhaps some additional technical skill to allow them to deliver that in a different way. One of the key things that we talked a lot about skills, but is knowledge. So how do we give people the understanding and the knowledge that they need to see, I need to apply my skill in this way, to deliver a different way of doing business and a different way of looking after my home and a different way of doing this. So how do we not just re-skill, but re-knowledge people and inspire them into a new way of thinking?
I've never heard about re-knowledging before. I rather like re-knowledging. Alyssa, last word to you. Actually, when we sort of, we've got the long transition, we've then got the final result, does green then sort of wither away?
It's funny because I think I was going to make the point that the question asked, that I don't think there will be such a thing as a green job. I'll take it from a different angle, from a kind of communications angle, bringing people on board. So I think from a perspective of people like us, who maybe a bit, not to insult anyone here, or a compliment, technocratic, policy wonks, then talking about green skills makes sense, because we see a challenge, we're trying to figure out what's needed to make something happen and mobilize it. So that makes sense, we want to define it and make it happen. But I think that, for me, the reason why people talk about green jobs a lot is because traditionally, if you think 20 or 30 years ago, doing something in a green way would be associated in making a loss. And it's been the introduction of the idea of green skills and green jobs is basically introducing people to the idea that a greener, cleaner future is one that's economically prosperous. So the more that you link green to jobs or green to skills makes people feel really positive about that future vision. That's great when it does that. What my concern is that there are some people who hear the word green and they think that's not for me. So they might hear the word green and they might go, I don't want a green job. I feel really comfortable in the construction sector. That's my identity. What's a green construction sector? That's the identity of a liberal elite sitting in Carlton Gardens. So I actually think we should be cautious about labeling things too much as green skills or green jobs. We need to think about how that works as a communication device. And I also am worried about the cowboys, the poor educators out there. If those people go off and label lots of things as green skills and green jobs, and they're terrible quality jobs, or they're terrible training and so on, all people are going to remember is, oh, this green stuff is rubbish.
Yeah.
So let's go for good quality jobs that deliver the future vision we want.
Okay, that's, I think, a fantastic point on which to end. So I just want to end by thanking all of you for coming. Thanks to everybody who's been watching. Thanks in particular to my fantastic panel, Sam, Ian, Tom, and Alyssa. And I just wanted to do a couple of trailers before you go. So next week, and again in partnership with Imperial Colleges Forum, we are doing a climate change data bites, where we're going to learn about climate data with people from the Met Office, people from Office for National Statistics who've developed a climate change data portal. So that's going to be really fun with our colleague Gavin Freegard, because whatever happens here, Gavin's prepared to green himself in order to have a green data bites rather than let anyone from IFG's Net Zero team anywhere near it, because he knows his brand. And then on the 18th of July, we're back again for the final one in this series, partnering with Imperial, but this time it's going to be on modelling. And we have the Modeller Supreme, Neil Ferguson, coming to talk to us. That's not about climate, but obviously modelling is a very big issue when you're looking at climate science and climate futures. And with all of that, can I just ask you to thank the panel, and thank you all very much.